We will not sell our future for crumbs. We will not bow before those who built their empires on our silence. Africa will stand, not as a shadow of others, but as a master of its own destiny. For decades, Africa's story was written with someone else's pen. Oil left its shores unrefined. Gold was taken before it was purified. And what remained was silence. A silence heavy with waiting, heavy with permission that never came. But that silence is ending. From the ports of Lagos to the red earth of Ouagadougou, a new rhythm is rising, the rhythm of ownership. Nigeria now refines its own oil. Burkina Faso now refines its own gold. Two nations, two revolutions, one message. Africa will no longer sell its future at a discount. Even global headlines call it the Great African Awakening. And at the center of it all stands one man, President Ibrahim Traoré, the fearless young leader of Burkina Faso. To Traoré, freedom begins not with slogans, but with sovereignty, taking control of resources, production, and destiny itself. Stay with us to find out how this movement began, and how one young soldier's vision is reshaping the entire continent. For nearly half a century, Nigeria lived a paradox that few outside Africa could imagine. It exported more crude oil than any other African nation, yet depended on imported fuel to power its own cities. A nation that fueled the world, but not itself. That painful irony began to change in 2025, when billionaire industrialist Aliko Dangote unveiled the Dangote Refinery, the largest single-train refinery ever built in Africa. Operating at 94% capacity, it processed over 610,000 barrels of crude oil every day, producing gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and liquefied petroleum gas, all within Nigeria's borders. For the first time, Nigerians filled their tanks with fuel made from their own soil. It wasn't just energy. It was dignity in liquid form. As the first tankers left Lagos, the echo spread from Ghana to Burkina Faso. If Nigeria can reclaim its oil, others can reclaim their gold, their copper, their cobalt, and deep within the Sahel, a small nation, prepared to ignite a transformation that would make the world take notice. Deep in the heart of the Sahel, where the red earth stretches beyond the horizon, lies Burkina Faso, a land rich in minerals, pride, and resilience. Yet for decades, more than 70% of its exports came from raw gold that enriched everyone, but its own people. Trucks rolled out daily carrying unrefined treasure to Europe and beyond, while miners in Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso watched their wealth vanish into foreign hands. But in November 2023, everything changed. Under the leadership of President Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso broke a century-old chain. He announced the construction of the nation's first-ever national gold refinery, a fortress of sovereignty rising in the capital city. According to Africa News, the refinery would begin producing 22-carat bars within a year, capable of refining over 150 tons of gold annually. By late 2025, the furnaces were roaring, and the nation's first test batch of pure Burkinabe gold was ready to roll out. This was more than an industrial project. It was a declaration of independence. Burkina Faso would no longer export its pride in unfinished form. It would refine, certify, and brand its own gold, its own destiny. The announcement sent shockwaves through the region. Crowds filled the streets of Ouagadougou, waving flags, chanting one name over and over. Traoré, Traoré, the son of the people. To the world it sounded like rebellion. To his people it sounded like truth. Jobs were created. Wealth began circulating within national borders. And most importantly, a sense of dignity returned to the miners whose sweat once enriched foreign vaults. Each bar of Burkinabe gold became a symbol of sovereignty, a reminder that Africa's worth could no longer be measured by outsiders. Foreign media rushed to label Traoré a radical populist, a young revolutionary. Western analysts warned that his policies could scare away investors. But to millions of Africans, he became something greater, a symbol of dignified rebellion, proof that courage still existed in leadership. He refused to play the post-colonial script, export cheap, import expensive, and remain dependent forever. Instead, he rewrote the narrative. We will refine, we will build, we will rise. As refinery walls climbed higher, diplomats in Paris grew nervous. Contracts were re-evaluated. Mining companies demanded explanations, and whispers began to circulate through the corridors of power. What if other African nations follow Burkina Faso's example? Because they were beginning to, from Nigeria's refineries to Ghana's new mining policies, to Mali's talk of regional unity, the fire Traoré lit in the Sahel was spreading across the continent, and when asked whether he feared isolation from the West, Traoré simply smiled and said, "You cannot isolate a people who have found themselves." That one line traveled farther than any pipeline or trade route. It reached the farmers of Mali, the students of Ghana, the oil workers of Nigeria. In that moment, it was no longer one nation's stand. It was an African awakening. But every awakening shakes the world. And as 2025 unfolded, those tremors began reaching Washington, Paris, and Brussels. Because when a small African nation decides to own its destiny, the world's balance of power begins to tilt, and those accustomed to control start to panic. When Burkina Faso's gold refinery lit its first furnace, the flames were more than metal and heat. They were a signal seen across oceans. From Abuja to Washington, from Paris to Beijing, the world turned to look at the small nation that had dared to say no. Western newspapers labeled Traoré a populist soldier and anti-West radical. Financial analysts warned that nationalizing gold mines would destabilize investor confidence. But inside Burkina Faso, the streets told a different story. Flags in the wind, drums in the night, people chanting the name of the man who restored their pride. The government's revenue from refined gold had already surpassed 11 tons by early 2025, compared to barely 8 the year before. To Wall Street, those were small numbers. But to Africa, they were proof. Proof that independence could be measured not in speeches, but in ounces. For decades, the West praised African nations for progress, so long as progress meant dependency disguised as aid. But when Burkina Faso chose real progress, control, dignity, production, the same voices called it dangerous. Corporations demanded new contracts, diplomats sought clarifications, and policy institutes began whispering about a Sahel crisis. Yet through the noise, the refinery walls continued to rise, its furnaces roaring like the heartbeat of a continent rediscovering itself. When journalists asked Traoré if he feared sanctions or isolation, he replied calmly, "We have lived under isolation for centuries. The difference now is that we chose it, and that changes everything." That single statement became a continental slogan. It was shared by students in Nairobi, by engineers in Lagos, and painted across murals in Accra. The Burkina spirit was no longer about one man. It was about one truth. Africa no longer needs permission to prosper. In Washington, analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies released cautious statements. They called it a wave of economic nationalism that could reshape Africa's partnerships. Publicly, American officials congratulated African nations for pursuing self-reliance. Privately, in boardrooms and embassy cables, the tone was nervous. Because if Africa began refining its own oil, gold and cobalt, Western leverage would shrink, and the profit chains that had ruled for centuries would begin to crumble. Each barrel refined in Lagos, each gold bar purified in Ouagadougou, each ton of cobalt processed in Kinshasa. Together, they whispered a revolutionary truth. Africa no longer needs permission to be powerful. But not everyone in the West viewed it as a threat. Writers in The Atlantic and Foreign Policy called it Africa's moral correction, a long overdue restoration of dignity, not defiance. For older Americans, this message struck a familiar chord. They recognized the echo, the fight for ownership, identity, and freedom once waged on their own soil. And just like that, the African awakening stopped being a distant story. It became a mirror. Yet power never surrenders quietly. Mining conglomerates began lobbying for stability clauses. Financial institutions quietly reviewed African credit ratings. Think tanks warned of resource nationalism. But through the pressure, Burkina Faso stood firm. Each furnace that glowed beneath the Sahel sun was a reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to finish what others said could not be done. By the final months of 2025, the world was watching, not in curiosity, but in anxiety. And one question began to haunt the old empires. If Africa can refine its own destiny, Who will it need next? Because the answer was already forming. In whispers across the Sahel, in boardrooms across Africa, and in the mind of one determined leader who wasn't done yet. By late 2025, the tremors from Burkina Faso's refinery had become a continental movement. Across Mali, Niger, Ghana, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the message spread like wildfire. Africa can refine its own destiny. Reports from Africa News described a quiet but powerful alliance forming in the heart of the Sahel. Several nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, had begun confidential talks to create the first African Regional Metals Exchange. The plan? A revolutionary platform that would allow African countries to set their own gold and metal prices, trade in regional currencies, and certify minerals under African standards, rather than relying on London or New York. It was a bold idea. Some said impossible. But for Ibrahim Traoré, it was inevitable. We cannot speak of freedom while others decide the value of our gold, he declared during a visit to the nearly completed Ouagadougou refinery. If Africa owns its resources, Africa will own its future. Western economists called it economic nationalism. African youth called it justice. And in the streets of Bamako, Lagos, and Accra, the people gave it a name of their own: the Burkina effect. The Burkina effect wasn't just economic, it was psychological. For generations, Africa had been told that progress required permission, but now that illusion was breaking. In Nigeria, Dangote's refinery symbolized oil independence. In Burkina Faso, Traoré's gold refinery stood for sovereignty. In Ghana, new plans for bauxite processing were under review. In Zambia, copper was being smelted domestically for the first time in decades. And in Congo, scientists were exploring how to refine cobalt for electric vehicle batteries on African soil, not in foreign factories. Each story carried the same heartbeat. Africa's wealth will stay in Africa. Across the continent, universities began adding new programs in metallurgy, process engineering, and resource management. For the first time in years, African economists were talking about production instead of aid. Older generations who had survived coups, dictatorships, and IMF austerity found themselves daring to hope again. In marketplaces from Accra to Nairobi, you could hear people saying, "We are not poor. We were just never allowed to keep what was ours." In those words lay the soul of the new revolution. Not a fight of guns, but a fight of ownership. In Washington, the tone shifted from curiosity to concern. Reports warned that Africa's new self-reliance could reshape global profit chains. Each barrel refined in Lagos, each gold bar stamped in Ouagadougou, meant fewer tankers to Europe, fewer exports to foreign vaults, and more power in African hands. But in cities like New York and London, a new phrase began to surface in business circles: the Burkina paradigm. It described the unstoppable trend of African nations reclaiming control of their industries. Economists couldn't ignore the numbers anymore. In less than 2 years, African domestic refining capacity had increased by 300%. Export dependency was falling, and local employment was rising. This wasn't charity. It wasn't rebellion. It was balance. A continent reclaiming what had always been its own. For Traoré, the refinery was just the beginning. He envisioned a network of African-owned industries, from mining to technology, built on cooperation, not competition. And his message was simple: Africa is not against the world. Africa is simply for itself. That single line transformed into a continental philosophy. From political speeches to classrooms, from factories to news studios, the narrative of dependency was dying. Because for the first time since colonization, Africa wasn't reacting to the global economy. It was shaping it. And as Burkina Faso prepared to roll out its first stamped gold bars bearing the national seal, the continent watched in pride. Each golden ingot wasn't just metal. It was a mirror reflecting the dawn of self-belief. The dawn over the Sahel is unlike any other. The sunlight there doesn't just rise. It reveals. It shines over a continent that is no longer waiting for validation, no longer defined by poverty or pity, but by purpose. By the end of 2025, the furnaces of Ouagadougou glowed like beacons of rebirth. Men and women who once toiled for foreign companies now worked proudly under the Burkina flag. For them, this refinery was not merely an industrial site. It was proof that their labor finally belonged to them. Across the windswept dunes, one phrase echoed through villages and cities alike: "This time the story is ours." Africa's transformation is not loud, it is deliberate. And perhaps that's what makes it so revolutionary. Because real power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it endures. So as dawn rises again over the Sahel, the horizon gleams not just with sunlight, but with belief, resilience, and rebirth. The question now is no longer, can Africa rise? It's who can stop her? And if the courage of Ibrahim Traoré and the people of Burkina Faso touches your heart, then share this story. Let it echo across classrooms, newsrooms, and every place where Africa's story was once written by others. Subscribe to Africa Forever, and stay with us as we continue the journey of a continent no longer on its knees, but standing tall, building, and believing. May God bless Africa, the continent that finally remembered its worth and decided to live by it.